There was a stretch of time not that long ago where fans of musical theater would be teased about yet another show getting a big splashy Hollywood adaptation, only to find the end result, not what they expected. Or, well, maybe it was exactly what we expected. So, when I heard they were making a movie adaptation of Jonathan Larson's Tick, Tick, Boom, I was understandably apprehensive. Not just for fear of yet another subpar movie musical, but wondering what Hollywood would make of Jonathan Larson and his story. We all have our gateway musicals, and that was Rent for me as a teenager. Yes, I was a Rent head. I wore out the cast album, learned every single lyric to every single song, scoured LimeWire for bootleg recordings of the show, sorry about that, and like many Rent fans, I eventually found Tick, Tick, Boom through its cast album. It's a rather unusual musical in a lot of ways, and while its story has essentially stayed the same through the years, Tick, Tick, Boom has been through a metamorphosis in form, content, and performance style. Its evolution is especially unique, given the conspicuous absence of its author. So in this episode, we're going to get into it. What led Jonathan Larson to write Tick, Tick, Boom, its evolution through the years, and how its unlikely Hollywood adaptation is actually a cut above the rest. I've talked about Jonathan Larson a few times on this channel, acknowledging his influence on the musical theater and the complicated legacy that surrounds the success of Rent. Rather than focus on what his work represents, I think it's valuable to know who he was and contextualize the environment he was working in. Jonathan had grown up in Westchester County, a suburb north of New York City. He had started as an actor, but not long after moving to the city in 1982, he shifted to composing for the musical theater, an art form that he adored. He was also a fan of rock and roll and singer-songwriters like Elton John and Billy Joel. From the beginning, he set out to combine his love of rock and roll with the musical theater. This wouldn't be easy, for with few exceptions, the theater's relationship with rock music had been fleeting and condescending at best. Beginning in the 1960s, the musical theater as an institution seemed both ill-prepared and unwilling to confront the galvanizing cultural shifts that were happening in America. And while it wasn't like Broadway was at a standstill in the 1970s and 80s, the American musical theater invested most of its energies in the promotion of its past and traditions, relegating new voices like William Finn and Michael John LaChiusa to try their works off-Broadway. Soon, the theater district would be dominated by British mega-musicals from the likes of Andrew Lloyd Webber and Cameron Mackintosh, ripe and ready for the rabid consumerism that had sprung in the 1980s. Jonathan set out to create a satirical musical that would speak to the materialism and hypocrisy of the time. While initially trying to adapt George Orwell's 1984, he ultimately wrote Superbia, a futuristic dystopia about the growing influence of television, technology, and the desensitization of people by the media, which, yeah. Jonathan developed Superbia over the course of 7 years, with readings taking place at the Public Theater and Playwrights Horizon. John's new wave and rock and roll score was noted for its innovation, as was John's strong concept for the show. But its daunting size and the inherently problematic book were always an issue, and the show failed to receive a staged production, which, of course, was deeply disappointing for Jonathan. So in 1990, Jonathan began writing what he called a rock monologue. Conceived as a one-man show, he vented all his frustrations surrounding his precarious bohemian lifestyle, his fear of turning 30, and being thought of as a failure. Initially called 3090, he changed the title to Boho Days, but when no one knew what boho meant, he settled with Tick, Tick, Boom, an allusion to his growing and pressing anxiety. The show was intensely personal, allowing John to share many aspects from his own life, working as a waiter at the Moondance Diner, being coaxed into joining a focus group for a market research firm. At times, this required John to play multiple roles at once. While he referred to real-life figures, like his mentor and idol Stephen Sondheim, with reverence, he was far more critical of others, like his constantly absent agent, Flora Roberts. So in Tick, Tick, Boom, she becomes Rosa Stevens. Jonathan also rendered a version of his longtime girlfriend, Janet Charleston, who here becomes the character of Susan. In changing her name, it allowed Jonathan to take dramatic license in the telling of his story. In Tick, Tick, Boom, Susan is a struggling dancer who contemplates leaving New York to seek solace working at an ashram. Now, like Susan, Janet Charleston was a dancer and did go out of town for such retreats, but she never actually wanted to quit her dance career. In fact, Janet Charleston is still very much dancing today. The dramatic license Jonathan takes with his characters is more of a projection of his own feelings and concerns. In Susan's case, John's fear of his girlfriend leaving him. John's early rendering of Susan as a naive new wave practitioner isn't wholly complimentary. Along with the vain and bimboish Caressa and the jealous and shrewish ex-girlfriend Marta, it has been noted that Jonathan's female characters are somewhat wanting. This criticism has carried over to some of his later and better-known female characters, which, honestly, I think is a valid point to consider. Jonathan also drew inspiration from his friendship with Matthew O'Grady, and in him, we have a very influential figure who is important not only to Tick, Tick, Boom, but the story of Rent. Jonathan and Matt met as children in White Plains, and by their teens were best friends. In Tick, Tick, Boom, Matt becomes Michael, John's former roommate who has quit acting to start a high-paying job in advertising. While Matt O'Grady did work in this field and did try to offer John opportunities, he was never an actor, and the two had never lived together. Matt himself would explain, "I wouldn't live with him. Everyone thought I was his roommate." In Tick, Tick, Boom, he set it up like there was an odd couple scenario, and that's what it would have been, but I'm much cleaner than he was. He was like 100% straight bachelor guy. John had moved to New York at the rise of the AIDS epidemic, and in 1987, Matt O'Grady told Jonathan that he was HIV positive. As a way to support his friend, he began accompanying Matt to the support group Friends Indeed, before eventually becoming a volunteer himself. By the 1990s, more friends of his, like Gordon Rogers, Ali Gertz, and Pam Shaw, would all be diagnosed before ultimately succumbing to the virus. John would address the AIDS epidemic in Tick, Tick, Boom, but the subject loomed too large for a 90-minute show, and it would take his next project to go even further with it. The then-titled Boho Days was first performed off-Broadway at Second Stage for a handful of nights in September 1990. A year later, it played 2 performances at the Village Gate nightclub, by then finally titled Tick, Tick, Boom. Produced by Jonathan Larson's friend, Victoria Leacock, and Robin Goodman of Second Stage, the show featured John at the piano with a live rock band, and Jonathan's friend, Roger Bart, on backup vocals. It would go on to receive further development with New York Theatre Workshop's O Solo Mio festivals in 1992 and 1993. But this would be the end of the road for Tick, Tick, Boom, at least with Jonathan involved. By then, he was fully immersed in developing Rent and intently trying to get Jim Nicola of the New York Theatre Workshop to produce it. Jonathan had actually started Rent in 1989, before Tick, Tick, Boom. Some may have also felt the piece had reached its fullest potential. While John was confident as a performer, the physical logistics of him being at the piano with minimal and restrictive blocking kept the show from being particularly engaging. By then, producer Jeffrey Seller had taken an interest in Jonathan's work, and when Seller proposed the prospect of another actor performing the piece, Jonathan recoiled. To him, it was at heart an autobiographical piece, and he couldn't abide the idea of anyone else performing it. Jonathan Larson's stubbornness and resistance to collaboration is well accounted for. For a long time, he subscribed to the strict ideology that one should either stay true to oneself or give in to compromise, or as he would often call it, selling out. These notions come up a lot in both Tick, Tick, Boom and Rent, usually presented so starkly black and white that, at times, the work bears an inherently fallible quality. By the time Rent was in rehearsal in 1995, John was evidently more open to the collaborative process, and some of the most memorable moments in the show are often attributed to this. Unfortunately, as we all know, Jonathan would not see his work before an actual audience. After the show's dress rehearsal at New York Theatre Workshop, Jonathan Larson went home to his apartment on Greenwich Street, made a cup of tea, and suffered an aortic aneurysm, passing away at the age of 35 on January 25, 1996, the morning of Rent's first scheduled performance off-Broadway.
We dedicate this opening performance to our friend Jonathan Larson.
It's difficult to comprehend the kind of ambivalence that surrounds Rent and its overwhelming success, especially for friends and family of John's, who knew firsthand how hard he struggled to get his work recognized. And then to be out in front of cameras and talking to newspaper reporters while you were still working through your own grief seems frankly unbearable to me. But it seems the overwhelming sentiment shared by those closest to John has always been to have his work heard, and in doing so, keeping his memory alive. In 1999, as productions of Rent continued to open around the world, Victoria Leacock and Robin Goodman came together again to see if Tick, Tick, Boom could find further life. After securing funds from backers' auditions, the pair, acting as producers, hired Scott Schwartz as the show's director. It was agreed that the script required revisions, and Robin Goodman sought playwright David Auburn, who she had recently worked with on the play Proof at Manhattan Theatre Club, to revise Tick, Tick, Boom's text. This process involved poring over Larson's various drafts of the show, which all had varying song lists, watching Victoria Leacock's archival footage of the show, and listening to John's cassette demos. While initially apprehensive of taking on unproduced drafts of someone else's work, Auburn was relieved to find the material vivid, funny, and rich. One of the biggest shifts in the show's structure was taking the weight of the show off of one single actor. An early reading had expanded the piece to 2 actors, where Jonathan was played by Anthony Rapp and the role of Susan was played by Amy Spanger. David Auburn would rewrite much of Tick, Tick, Boom's script, while ultimately trying to stay true to Jonathan's tone and language. He would go on to say, "Among the ideas that I contributed was that it should really end with his birthday, and that the show should be restructured, so that it built up to that birthday party, and we should build in the experience of the workshop of Superbia, so that was something you could experience and have the disappointment of along with the Jonathan character." The expansion of the Superbia sequence allowed the addition of the song Come to Your Senses, which had actually been written for Superbia before ultimately being cut. In this new context, the actress Caressa performs the song during the workshop performance, and at some point, from John's perspective, she becomes the character of Susan, giving John a metaphysic plea for reason. Auburn forged space to revise Susan's character as well. Rather than fleeing her dance career for an ashram, her plight becomes about the incessant pace and lifestyle of New York. From her perspective, she can still be a dancer if she moved to New England, only there she'd have a dishwasher. Eventually, David Auburn and director Scott Schwartz agreed to expand the piece to 3 actors, the third primarily representing the character of Michael. The expansion of 3 voices to the piece presented new musical challenges, so Robin Goodman enlisted Stephen Oremus, who had been the music director for Rent's national tour, to rearrange Tick, Tick, Boom's score. Like Auburn's process, this involved the meticulous poring over drafts of old material. Many of Jonathan's early music manuscripts were sparse lead sheets, basically just chord changes for the songs, which, if you were lucky, included lyrics. So that meant Oremus had to virtually start from scratch in rescoring Tick, Tick, Boom, painstakingly notating detailed arrangements for a rock band. While doing this, he would stay true to Jonathan's music, while not making it feel intrinsically specific to the early 1990s. This new version of Tick, Tick, Boom would premiere off-Broadway in May of 2001, with Amy Spanger returning to play Susan, Jerry Dixon playing Michael, and Raul Esparza taking on the role of John. While never approaching the hyperbolic success of Rent, the show was well received and earned an Outer Critics Circle Award for Best Off-Broadway Musical. In Jonathan's early drafts of the show, he often returned to his fear of growing older, to feel so under pressure that his heart would burst in his chest. With permission from the Larson family, many of those references were taken out altogether. According to David Auburn, those references weren't so much removed as de-emphasized. You didn't really want to feel like you were going for cheap sentiment or pathos by preserving a lot of that original language that would have had such a dark undertone. With our retrospective knowledge of what happened to him, Larson was a very ambitious guy who was very frustrated. And that kind of language is typical of what artists use when they're pissed off that their work isn't getting the recognition it deserves, and they're feeling that they're not young anymore. In a way, it's more innocent than that. And I didn't want the show to be about this doomed artist. I wanted the show to be about this very ambitious and driven artist. I think that detail is key in making Tick, Tick, Boom not feel exploitative or emotionally manipulative. When Jonathan first performed this piece, he initially thought it so specific and autobiographical that no one else could perform it. With this new version of Tick, Tick, Boom, the show becomes something different. Jonathan Larson is not the performer, but the character whose story we follow. David Auburn's script seems to deliberately avoid any mention of Jonathan's surname, perhaps as a way to cultivate distance from our collective idea of him. In that, he becomes less emblematic, more human, and easier to relate to. And as it turns out, many people related to Jonathan Larson. From the moment he first appeared on the Broadway theater scene, Lin-Manuel Miranda has always cited Jonathan Larson as a major influence as a theater composer. Within the Heights, he brought hip-hop and rap music to the musical theater in a way that no one had done before. And yes, I am considering The Witch's rap from Into the Woods in this equation. But this was nothing compared to what he did with his next musical, Hamilton, making a cultural impact unlike anything in recent memory. The show's success and broad appeal has sometimes been compared to that of Rent's, in its revolutionizing of the musical theater in form and subject matter. In 2016, roughly around the time Miranda was finishing his run in Hamilton, film producer Julie O contacted him, explaining she held the film rights for Tick, Tick, Boom and wondered if he would be interested in adapting it to film. Miranda had seen the 2001 off-Broadway production as a college student and had himself played the role of John in the 2014 New York City Center revival of the show. He immediately said yes. With playwright Stephen Levinson hired to pen the screenplay, the two set out to frame the film using Tick, Tick, Boom's rock monologue origins. While David Auburn's iteration of Jonathan might have alluded to his real-life character model, Miranda and Levinson set out to remove any ambiguity about who this story was really about. For those familiar with Rent and the details of Jonathan Larson's life, this movie is chock full of Easter eggs that will keep musical theater fans coming back for multiple viewings. There are countless incredible details sewn throughout this film, be it something in the set design, a reference in a line of dialogue, a voicemail on Jonathan's answering machine. They even pay homage to Victoria Leacock and her archive recordings, which, along the way, have become a touchstone in bringing Jonathan's story to life. All these details quietly collapse the space between Andrew Garfield's Jonathan and the real-life Jonathan Larson. The long-gone Moondance Diner is lovingly brought back to life, and John's walk-up apartment at 508 Granite Street has been recreated with startling accuracy. The cast of this movie is a pure treat. If you're a Broadway fan watching this for the first time, you may find yourself gasping every couple of minutes. Lin-Manuel Miranda has made a point to include actors, as well as real-life figures, who have some connection to either Rent, Tick, Tick, Boom, or Jonathan Larson himself. And then, of course, is the cavalcade of Broadway cameos in the deliriously wonderful number, Sunday, which seems especially made for musical theater fans. Stephen Levinson gets space and time to flesh out the characters of Susan and Michael even further here. Both are played beautifully by Alexandra Shipp and Robin DeJesus. But the real revelation of this movie is Andrew Garfield. Beyond his incredible voice and powerful performance, both of which he should be recognized for, Andrew Garfield seemingly channels Jonathan Larson's quirky and frenetic energy, even adopting his iconic mop top of hair. And with Lin-Manuel Miranda, the Larson family, and Jonathan's real-life friends readily available as resources and wells of information, Andrew Garfield seems to have truly captured the essence of Jonathan. It really is impressive what Lin-Manuel Miranda has done in his directorial debut. Where some Hollywood directors sheepishly navigate how to put a musical to film, Miranda knows this material well, and how he translates those instincts to another medium is truly astonishing. I think a lot of the success of Tick, Tick, Boom lies in its framing device, where the musical numbers emerge from John's one-man performance of the show. They give commentary to the story, or act as an extension of John's imagination. Miranda has acknowledged Bob Fosse's influence in using this device. In his films, Cabaret and All That Jazz, both of which are among my favorite movie musicals, the numbers emerge as commentary to the story, sometimes even taking place exclusively in the mind of our main player. See also Rob Marshall's Chicago, and John Cameron Mitchell's Hedwig and the Angry Inch, who have also acknowledged Bob Fosse's influence in making these films. Also valuable to note that, like Lin-Manuel Miranda, both Marshall and Mitchell originally began their careers in the theater. By having this device in place, it serves as a nod to Tick Tick Boom's origins, while also justifying the presence of the musical numbers in a grounded and realistic medium. The film is a tribute to Jonathan Larson, to the theater, Broadway, and New York, and to anyone involved in the creation of art. Some may find the Broadway cameos, the inside jokes, and the story itself enough to alienate anyone not connected with the theater, and honestly, part of me isn't wholly bothered by that at all. This is, after all, about a guy who wrote for the theater. Obviously, certain concessions are made to appeal to as many people as possible. I personally found the narrated segments that bookend the film a bit heavy-handed, leaning the film into the tragic element of Jonathan's legacy. But for those who are not from the theater, putting Tick Tick Boom into context with the success of Rent would be helpful. I also believe, at face value, anyone can appreciate Tick Tick Boom's emotional story, as well as the film's many outstanding performances, whether or not you know anything about Jonathan Larson or the history of the show. Tick Tick Boom has gone through a unique evolution, subject to reinterpretations that have taken it far from its humble beginnings. But the goal in every iteration has been to remain faithful to Jonathan Larson and his voice, particularly in his loud absence. Some may come to this film with preconceived ideas of Jonathan or lingering feelings about rock musicals like Rent. Over the years, Larson's dramaturgical shortcomings have become a point of discussion, with some viewing his work as a misguided and sanctimonious glorification of the bohemian lifestyle, which, in my opinion, is a rather glib, trite, and ironically sanctimonious summary of his life and work. There are many resources available that help forge a sense of who this man was, some of which I will mention at the end of this video. What I think this film and Andrew Garfield do beautifully is encapsulate the many facets of who Jonathan was. We see his passion, talent, and drive, along with his stubbornness and naivete. The point is, by the end, he learns from his failures, what he cannot control, and moves on to the next endeavor. For those in the arts, the pandemic has been an especially trying time, and some, like myself, may find renewed hope and energy in watching this movie. Jonathan Larson and his story loom very large in the lives of many, and yet again, I find myself grateful for what he has given us and continues to give us today. Thank you for watching this episode. If you like this content and want to see more, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. For those curious to learn more about Jonathan Larson, there are many resources, like the quote-unquote Rent Bible, a compilation of interviews, rare photos, and accounts of Jonathan's life, compiled and curated by Evelyn McDonnell and Catherine Silberger. There is also Boho Days, the wider works of Jonathan Larson by Jay Collis, and The Jonathan Larson Project, a compilation of many of his unheard songs produced by Ghostlight Records. Thanks again for watching. Till next time, stay tuned.